Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Changing the Narrative. I am Murray Osborne, and my co host is.
Elizabeth Rouse, welcome back, friends.
Welcome back, friends. And those of you who we don't know who might not be our friends or have
They
negative,
can be our friends too.
or
It's
they
we're
can't be our
we're we're a welcoming group.
friends. Sorry. Today, we are talking about self advocacy and self confidence. And this
Hmm.
is quite a big topic, I think, for people with blindness and low vision. And for I guess many years, it's been something that you see in differences around the world.
Hmm.
And I think, that kind of goes to the bigger picture of disability holistically, not just blindness and low vision, but certainly here in the United States, I feel like there's still that level of institutionalization that still thinks that people with disabilities essentially can't do a lot of things. And so it's probably more prevalent here in the United States than it might be in Europe or parts of Australia, as an example. So I've kind of seen both sides of that coin. And whenever I come here and work here, I definitely see that, people have to prove themselves more and be more self confident and have the ability to be able to advocate for themselves at a higher level, maybe, than they do in other parts of the world. So, Elizabeth, you being here, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I have significantly less, I think, world travel experience than Marie does. We'll have to compare our country lists sometime. But I think that this topic is particularly important because this plays a lot into the way that you see yourself, right? We talk a lot about projecting ourselves into the world with confidence. And the more confident you are, the less likely people are going to assume your incompetence. Okay. So if you look like you know where you're going or you look like you know what you're doing, people are less likely to assume that you don't. Right. So I always say fake it till you make it takes on a whole new form of its own when you're looking at the world of disability advocacy, right? Um, this could look like me asking for help in an airport and being told, oh, yeah, we can grab you a wheelchair, right? My immediate response is, my eyes are broken, but my legs work fine, right? Or whatever you want to say, to each their own. But I think that it's a very interesting existence to have the assumption be made for you that you can't do something, right? So the more that you can project that confidence, the less likely that is to happen. I see that a lot, particularly in larger cities. I remember being in New York City and being with somebody who's like a New York City native, right? Just walking somewhere. I don't even remember where we were going. And somebody assumed that I needed help crossing the street and they grabbed my arm. And being a young woman from a very rural community, my immediate thought was like, oh my gosh, I'm about to be the next victim on Law and Order Special Victims Unit, right? Like I was so scared because I was like, someone is touching me without my consent. And the reality of the matter is this sweet woman was probably just trying to help me, but she didn't assume my competence. She assumed my incompetence, right? So in that moment, advocating for me looked like jerking my arm away and saying, please don't touch me, right? We all have that boundary, and knowing your boundaries can help you be the best advocate that you can be. So, Murray, I'm wondering what, if any, are your like necessary advocacy boundaries? Like, what is your limit? Where do you decide I have to say something or I need to do something?
I tend to take an approach where I'm definitely more educational than
Mm-hmm.
confrontational.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that's not always great from a big picture perspective, but I feel like, as you just said, that lady that tried to help you had good intentions,
Mm-hmm.
just bad education. And
Mm-hmm.
so I always kind of try and think about that instance, and I'll talk to people. I'll use blind low vision tennis as a good example. So when I have a meeting with someone at the USTA, US Tennis Association, my first thing is that, hey, it's okay if you don't know everything about disability, and I want you to feel comfortable in talking to me about the things that you don't know. Even if you think that they're stupid questions or you might offend me, I'm not going to be offended, because it's more important for me to be able to educate you so you can go and do lessons and teach people with blindness and low vision to be able to play tennis.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, my role as an educator is to educate you and make you feel comfortable. here in the United States, I feel like there is not a lot of people who feel comfortable
Mm-hmm.
around people with disabilities holistically, let alone blindness and low vision. And obviously, the big part for me is that blindness and low vision is a spectrum, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I have a unique story to tell you that happened to me this week, actually, which is really quite funny. I
Mm-hmm.
went and looked at an indoor recreation facility that had pickleball and tennis courts in Spokane, Washington State. And the woman who was the center manager did not want me to walk down the stairs because she felt like I couldn't walk down the stairs, even though I don't actually use a white cane or have a guide dog, which maybe led to her thinking if he doesn't have either of those two things, I don't want him falling down the stairs and having to write an incident report.
Mm-hmm.
So she's like, well, you just wait here and I'll come right back, okay? Just wait here. Don't walk down the stairs. And I said, I'm quite capable of walking down the stairs. I said, I have 10% vision, and so blindness is a spectrum. And I was explaining that to her. She was still a little bit unsure, but she did let me walk down the stairs, which was an advantage. But
Did you trip on purpose just to scare her? Because I
no, I
definitely would have
should
tripped
have.
on purpose. I absolutely would have.
But that's just another point of just saying, like, people don't know, people don't understand, people haven't been educated. And so, from my aspect, I kind of take that less aggressive approach, but I do understand that people get annoyed and frustrated, and it's something they have to do all day, every day, and it gets old real quick.
Mm-hmm.
I think, there needs to be a campaign of some sort around disability awareness holistically and the spectrum of each disability to be able to educate people on actually what it means. And I just feel like people just don't know what that spectrum means and what people can and can't do. And obviously, look, in this, government change, it started with really poor, I guess, assessments and comments around blind people and people with low vision being in roles that didn't necessarily know things or react to things that were wrong in that role that needed to be
Mm-hmm.
changed. Well, that's a lot of people, not just people with blindness and low vision. And so I think, working with government agencies and working with, whole groups of people, I've seen a lot of incompetent people who have no disability over my years. And so I think it's really easy to be able to say, well, he's blind and he didn't see this happening, or he didn't do this or react in the way that he should have. So people with blindness are incapable. And it's frustrating, I think, for the blindness community that we don't get on top of that bigger discussion around actual awareness and what awareness means and how we do it, and how we do it in mainstream society. Because that's one thing that I definitely see as probably most lacking in the United States comparably to other places that I've been in Europe and Australia.
I do think one thing that's going to help drive that change forward, and this is my pipe dream, right? I don't know if you've noticed this, Murray, but little kids have just this like uninhibited sense of curiosity,
Yeah.
right? Like they'll walk up to you and be like, "What's your stick for?" Right? And parents are just mortified and they're like, "Oh my God, don't look at that person, don't talk to that person, don't breathe in their direction." And it's like, actually, if you'd let me answer the kid's question, we can take away the fear factor of disability, right?
Yeah.
It's like my cane's not going to touch your kid and give them blindness, right? Believe it or not, spoiler alert, guys, it's not how it works. So my favorite moments are the moments when parents allow kids to ask those questions. I don't care if we're at the zoo, I don't care if we're in the grocery store, right? Like if I'm in a place where I can share, I'm gonna get down to that kid's level and I'm gonna say, well, this is actually my cane, right? I use this to navigate because I can't see very well. So my cane always goes before my feet so that I know that where I'm walking is safe, right? And I'll let them hold my cane and I might show them like how to walk in step or just like a super basic thing. And that like 3 minute interaction can change an understanding at such a young, like impressionable age. And then the next time they see a blind person, right, they might not be like, "Oh, what's that stick for?" They might be like, "Hey, I know that's called a cane," right? Or whatever it is. I believe in like the little changes that can lead to like a generation's attitudinal change. I don't think that's a word, but it's a word now. So shout out to those folks who not only right have the patience to let their kid ask that question, but also like have the patience to let somebody explain that to them, because I would say that happens far less than the parents who yank their kid out of the way, or who unknowingly, maybe unwittingly, show their kid that disability is something to fear. Right? I mean, let them
Yeah,
ask. There's nothing wrong with that curiosity.
yeah.
Curiosity killed the cat, but not the kid.
And do you think this is an interesting question for me because I kind of think it comes from both sides, right? So when somebody like you were talking about a parent doesn't ask those questions, do you think it's a fear thing or do you think it's a uh, ignorance thing or both?
I think they're afraid to be offensive. I
Yeah,
think we that circles back to your point of I'm afraid that my question, my naivety is going to offend you. And
yeah,
it's like, dude, I'd rather have you ask the question and risk offending me
yeah,
than ignore it, with the caveat, right? I die on the hill that until you know a little bit about me, my disability is none of your business, right?
yeah.
Like the ins and the outs. Like I hate when people walk up to me and they're like, are you really blind? It's like, you look like you can see. And I'm like, first of all, what does that even mean? Like, what does it mean that I look like I can see?
Right.
Okay. Second of all, hi, nice to meet you. My name's Elizabeth. I'm from Iowa. I'm traveling to such and such a location. How are you? How's your, like, let's have a conversation. Don't
Yeah,
act like, I don't walk up to someone and go, hey man, you look like you could use some weight. Like, how much do you weigh? Right? I don't do
right.
that. Like, nobody does that. And if you do, you should not do that. Um, so I kind of operate on the expectation. Like if somebody wants to ask me a question about my cane or about my braille display, totally okay. But like you don't need to know the ins and the outs of my disability if you don't know my name, right? I think that's super invasive and I think it's really disrespectful. Those are the kind of conversations that start me down the path of like, I'm sorry, who are you and what entitled you to be in my presence right now? Um, I think the other piece to dig into a little bit here, Murray, is the burden of being the educator,
Yeah,
right? I think it's really important to acknowledge that we do not always exist in a space where we can and do explain ourselves and our disabilities, right?
yeah,
I particularly notice this when I am tired. I don't have enough patience to stand in like a line. I'm not going to have enough patience to try and explain the ins and outs of my blindness to you, right? Like this is where we, need to talk about body language and the ways that we can communicate that to the world. So tag your that as our next episode, right? It's as simple as it's okay to not have that energy, right? And you are allowed to say, "Hey, I really appreciate your curiosity. I'm kind of having a day. Um, here's a card for the National Federation of the Blind or whoever you want to refer them to. They can answer a lot of your questions. I think your curiosity is great. I just don't have the emotional space to take on this question right now. And I don't mean to be rude. I apologize, but that's where I'm at, right? That's okay.
do you know if there has been a National Federation of the Blind, as an example, project around mainstream education of blindness and low vision?
I mean, every October is Blind Equality Achievement Month, right? We
Yeah, right.
talk about President Riccobono actually mentioned this in one of his most recent presidential releases. We talk about the history of the blindness movement. We talk about where we want to go, right? So I think there's a certain level of educational component to that. My chapter, as an example, participates more often than not. We do like a chat and chai event at a library, or we go and we read at Story Hour at a different library. When I was between undergrad and graduate school, I actually took in October and I went and I just like read a book on like Louis Braille and the creation of blindness to like 5 or 6 different classrooms, right? Like that was my educational tool because I think that younger kids are the way that we bridge that generational knowledge gap.
Yeah.
So I mean, yes is the easy answer. Every October is that, but it kind of depends on what the individual like chapters and groups decide that they want to do in the realm of general blindness education,
Yeah, and obviously there's White Cane Awareness Day and National Guide Dogs Day and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
there's other opportunities I know, but it seems like it's very insular, and still the education around blindness and low vision is very insular. And like you said, we live in a world now where everyone is so easily offended. Nobody wants to ask anything, and so
Yep.
then they continue to be misinformed and prejudge, and that's not good either. And so I think I always just take that approach that, hey, even if I don't want to, I'll educate because I'd rather educate than just, portray that myth that somebody has about me or my vision. So
Yeah.
it's, I don't see it too much anymore. And as I said, I don't use a white cane or a guide dog because I have 10% vision, that 2200 vision. And so I feel like a lot of people don't even know that I have, a vision impairment or low vision. And when they find out, then they do sometimes treat me differently than before when they were talking to me, which is also really interesting to me. If I'm talking to somebody and you're talking to me as you would anybody else, and then I explain my vision and then you talk to me differently,
Mm-hmm.
that is offensive to me because we've just been having a conversation. Why are you all of a sudden changing to talk slower or
Louder.
louder? Or, like it's
Yeah.
crazy. But like that's where advocacy also comes in. But I believe true advocacy has to have an educational component to it. And I don't hear that a lot, honestly. And that might just be my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what's worked for me very well in the past, and it
Yeah.
disarms people. Once they know that they're not going to offend me, and I talk up front about it and say, "Ask me anything you want." I'm good. I'd rather than just guess or have a perception that isn't true. And
Yeah.
then people relax. I would say 9 out of every 10 people relax when you tell them that, and you can have actually just a conversation that you want to have, and that's important. And so, we both work in the education system, and doing workshops with transitional students and things of that nature. And I think we talked a little bit about the last national convention at NFB and the divide that's happening right now between young adults and adults in that kind of 20 to 30 age category, 20 to 40 age category, and how, the majority of people in that 20 and below category have grown up in mainstream schooling, in a mainstream environment,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily that, I don't even know what to call it, but I always just kind of call it that institutionalized modeling, um, that formed who they are. And I definitely see a big difference in that. And so I think, again, looking at someone with total blindness who may be of an older age, with less skills and less training to a degree,
Mm-hmm.
I always think people think of the worst case scenario. I'll put it that way. If you tell
Yeah.
someone you're blind, they think of somebody who can't do anything. And
Well,
if,
they think of the stereotypes,
right,
right? They think
yeah,
of the person walking with a long white cane and super dark shades to hide like some sort of mutilation to their eyes, right? They think of the trauma. They assume incompetence,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think we have to get away from always thinking about the worst case scenario. And I do think we need to talk more about the advocacy around the spectrum of vision. And
Yeah.
in Australia, we had a lot of those conversations. Blindness isn't just blindness, and you hear a lot of people online, with TikTok and the community there talk about being told, just like you said, well, you don't look blind. What does that mean? And you don't understand really what blindness is. If I don't have enough vision to drive a car or, play mainstream sports or, read without assistance or use assistive technology, then, that gives me a distinct disadvantage against somebody who can do all of those things in an equal setting. And I think about this in the work setting, is people are quite capable with blindness and low vision, of working with the right adaptations. But 9 times out of 10 now, my fear in working with kids and families is that they don't want to seem to be different from anybody else. So they don't even ask for accommodations. And so that level of advocacy just kind of melts away. And then they struggle because it's more important to them that they're not seen as different rather than empowering themselves to be capable.
I think part of that, though, is also just the reality of being a kid, right? I mean, it's hard to be a fourth grader, a fifth grader, a sixth grader, because the things that do make you different make you weird, right? Because at that age, weird is a bad thing. Whereas, like when you get older, you can change the framing of that opinion. You can say, "Hey, I'm unique," right? Like the things that make us unique are the things that make us special, right? So, I mean, I was the kid when my school made the transition from like paper and pencils to every kid got a computer. I was the kid that said, I want the inaccessible Mac. I don't want the computer that I know how to use. I want the same case as everybody else. I don't want to be different, right? I was that kid.
Yeah,
And it took me a very long time to get to a point where I accepted who I was as a person. I mean, like, we're talking my early 20s, not like 15, right?
yeah,
Like I think fourth grade through like junior year of high school was just like sucked, right? So I think there's a lot of framing in that because I also saw, as a kid who didn't know a ton of blind adults, I also saw blindness as like not this great thing. And now I'm like, haha, I graduated undergrad debt free. I'm going to graduate school on like Voc Rehab's dime.
yeah.
You learn to work the systems and you learn to see the gold, the silver lining in your different situations or whatever you want to look at it as. But I also think it's really important to like validate, feeling different does suck sometimes, and that's okay. Like, it's a grieving process, right? I mean, we are different versions of ourselves every day, and you can grieve who you were yesterday or who you never got a chance to be. It's just making yourself not get stuck in that grief, right? Your dealt a card of hands, learn to play it. um
But talking to you about that transition is insightful because I think, people have different triggers about that, right? Of how they come to that point.
mhm,
But when you did start to embrace that and you were talking about, I don't want to be different, one thing that I always tell students is that you need to define who you are, right? And that's not about your vision, that's about who you want to be, how you want to be seen, and how you want to interact with the world. And if you can't define who you want to be, your sight is the secondary problem, right? Because
mhm,
uh, you don't have a good handle about who you are and what you want and how you want to be seen and how you want people to see you. So I always talk about that, and it's a little bit hard for a lot of kids because and students because they haven't come to that point yet. They're still either consumed by their blindness, and that's who they think they are, or the world sees them as somebody who they don't necessarily want to be, but they don't know how to change that.
yep,
And I think that's a really important topic for us to talk about in this podcast because defining who you want to be is so incredibly powerful that then your side is not the number one thing that you're thinking about. It's actually who you want to be, what you want to do, how you want to be seen. And I always think that's been a really good thing for me. I was a really curious kid and I
mhm,
used to, listen to talkback radio, and the internet was before my time, or after my time. And so, I used to read encyclopedias and be really interested
nerd,
in history. Yeah,
nerd.
totally. But I'd also go out and ride my bike with my friends and, play
Yep.
football and do all these things, right? And so life is a balance. Like you've got to follow things that you're interested in. You've got to be curious. You've got to ask questions. Kids who are put in the bubble where it's good enough to just do the minimum are going to
Mhm.
be those kids who really struggle in that transition period because
Yep.
they haven't found themselves, right? That's the
Well, and
most
the
important part.
expectations have already been lowered,
Yeah,
right?
right.
You got to hold yourself to a high standard.
Yeah, you do. And it's extra important, having that disability factor, but also not being defined by that disability factor. If I see resumes all the time of
Mhm.
transition students and it's all about their blindness, and I say, do you want to be seen as this person who's on the piece of paper here? No. Well, why is it here? Why aren't you talking about what you've achieved? Why aren't you talking about your interests? Why aren't you
Yep.
talking about all these things that are really important for someone to see you as more than your blindness when all you're
Mhm.
talking about is your blindness? And so it's hard for students, it's hard for families. I'm definitely not saying it isn't, and I've been through it, so I know it's hard, and I've felt all the things that they feel, but you have to break through and you have to have the courage and the self advocacy, more importantly, to look at yourself in the mirror and think about who you really want to be and what you really want to do. And that makes a huge change that I don't
Mhm.
know that the majority of people with blindness and low vision have done. And if they have done it, I definitely see the difference from them doing it rather than not doing it.
Yeah. The last kind of thought that I will toss out before I want to explore one more idea with you is, and I will always come back to the poster child of the NFB, right?
Yep.
Blindness is not the characteristic that defines you or your future,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
You want to
100%.
be so many more things before you want to be blind. You can be
Yep.
blind at the same time,
Right.
right? But you don't have to be the blind teacher. You can be a teacher who just so
Yeah.
happens to be blind. You don't have to be a blind writer. You can just be a writer who just so happens to
Yeah.
be blind, right? It's a piece of you. It's not the whole puzzle. And I think that that's really important to hone in on, right?
Is that person first language that is really important?
Which
Like,
is funny because I switch.
yeah,
I will say I am a blind person,
yeah,
but I will not say like I am a blind, I'm I say like I'm an
person with
associate.
blindness.
I don't even feel the need to toss out like, oh yeah, and
Yeah,
I'm blind, right? I
yeah,
just do what I do
right. I just
and
feel
go
like
from there.
that self discovery, you have to put the person first, is what I'm saying. And
Yeah. I mean,
and
you're a person before before you are
yeah, if you
blind.
talk about yourself being a blind person, then you're leading with the thing that you don't want to be defined by, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's that mental thought capacity where you're going out and you're actually doing that in public. You represent yourself as a blind person rather than
Mhm.
as a person who has, blindness or low vision. I feel
Yeah.
like that's just an important metaphor for people to actually get and understand.
Yeah. And sometimes sometimes I don't get it, right? We all
Yeah,
have ages and stages where we're growing and learning. Sometimes I say blind person, sometimes I say, person with a disability.
yeah,
I don't have a problem saying like I am a disabled person, but like some people aren't ready to say that yet. That's okay.
yeah,
The one other thing that I want to toss out, and this can be like a mic drop or this can be the start of another dialogue, Murray, is something that I just think is really important, right? And it seems really obvious, but it's not, okay? Self advocacy. That means you are doing it yourself for yourself. And I think like this sounds really dramatic or drastic or what have you, but nobody's going to do it for you for the rest of your life. So like it's great when you educate your community. When I go out in public with my parents or whatever, and somebody says like, "Hey, watch it, like move your stick." And my mom's like, "That's actually a cane and she's a blind person, so maybe get out of her way." Right? Like I've taught her to be sassy and sarcastic about my disability, so like that works. But my mom also knows, you know, I'm perfectly capable of doing that myself. I am the person that says on a cruise ship when someone walks up to me and says, "Can I pray for your eyes?" Actually, it's taken me a really long time to get to the fact where I've accepted the way that God made me. So, respectfully, I don't think that I'm broken. I think that I was made this way for a reason. I would really prefer that you didn't, but thank you so much for the offer, right?
yeah,
I don't let other people have that conversation for me
yeah,
unless I have like pre communicated, like, hey dude, I ain't got this in me, so you got to step up to the plate or whatever, right? I mean,
right.
just know it is a responsibility that you will have for the rest of your life. So find a way to get on board or get off the train, right? Like
Yeah,
those are your choices. And
yeah,
unfortunately, like yes, not all of us want to be built this way, but we are, and you got to pull yourself out of it and keep going. And if that means being your best advocate, like let's figure out how to do it together and keep going, because sitting on the curb crying is not going to work for the rest of your life. So I think it's really important to know like advocacy is important, but self advocacy is like the top tier of that to me. And I want everybody to feel empowered to use that voice to say, "Hey, don't grab me without my permission," or "Hey, you know, I always think of like restaurants, right? What does she want to order? She can actually order for herself. Thank you so much. I'll take this,"
right.
right? Use that voice. Don't be afraid to just like be who you are. Be the best version of yourself, even when it's hard.
How did you come to that place where you were confident to be able to self advocate effectively?
I think for me, it was a lot of painful growth. Um, 16 was a really hard year for me. I think I've shared this here before. And if I haven't, I've definitely shared this with you before. Um, I'm lucky that my parents didn't kick me out of the house when I was 16, because what happens when you turn 16 in the United States? You get your driver's license. Guess what you can't have if you're a blind person? A driver's license. Can't imagine why, right? Um,
Isn't there one state that doesn't do eye testing for driver's license?
South Carolina lets people with very different levels of disability or of visual acuity drive, and it makes me very nervous. So like stay off the sidewalks there. Just PSA. Um, but like I mean, I was mad. I was really angry at the world, and it took me a long time of frankly, having other opportunities like punch me in the face that like sighted people don't get for me to comprehend, like, okay, yes, there is give and take, you know. I embrace public transportation. I think that that's a really important tool. A lot of sighted people have never gotten on a city bus in their life, and they might never because they don't need to, right?
Hang
I'm
on,
saving
wait.
money.
Is
I'm
there,
not paying for
there's
car
public
insurance.
transport in Iowa?
Yes, there is a city bus in Des Moines, and there's actually some in Davenport and Iowa City too. Some of our bigger cities have them. It's shocking.
The
Um,
bus by the cornfields? Nice.
yeah, nah, by the cornfields. Yeah, but I think a lot of it was just like as I grew up, I got exposed to more opportunities. Some of them I found, and some of them found me. I would say another huge piece of that puzzle for me was attending and graduating from the Louisiana Center for the Blind, right? Kenneth Jernigan has this incredible speech called The Nature of Independence. And it talks all about the different stages of independence, right? From total dependency to, I can't remember. The second stage is like radical independence, right? It's, I don't need you. Don't do that for me. I can do it on my own, right? And then the third stage is like true independence, where, you know, you don't have to cook every meal and you don't have to wash every dish. Like having somebody step in and say, hey, I'd love to do this like with you or for you isn't a sign of like incompetence. It's a sign of like mutual respect, right? And coexisting.
Yeah,
So I think that's a really good one to check out to kind of further that conversation a little bit more to educate yourself. But I mean, the crappy reality of the answer is it takes time and it takes seeing other people living the lives that you want to live and doing the things that you want to do and asking the questions that you don't have answers to and figuring out who has those answers and hunting that person down with like vehemence. So it's just a lot of being willing to try and willing to learn and willing to fail, right? I mean, that's life.
yeah, 100%. Well, I think we've definitely, hopefully, motivated some people. We would love to hear about your experiences in self-advocacy. Put them in the comments. Give us feedback around this podcast. We are starting to market it a little bit more. Elizabeth, in my background image, I actually have this podcast, the picture that appears in the iTunes for our
Ooh.
with both of us on it and the Mirability logo. So yeah, we definitely are going to start promoting it a lot more. And if you like the podcast, you want us to tackle topics, let us know what topics you'd love to tackle, and we will pick them and talk about them.
Wait, look at this. You have a new background. I have decent lighting. We're going from a
I know,
low budget
right?
production to a slightly less low budget production.
That's very accurate.
This is great. Okay, resource share time.
Sure.
All right, I'm gonna just borrow from myself. Check out Kenneth Jernigan's The Nature of Independence. You can get it, I believe, in audio, in written format, in braille format. I don't care if you're blind. I don't care if you're a wheelchair user. I don't care if you're a diabetic. Like whatever your disability is, I truly think it's a great lesson for all of us. Even if you're an ally, right? I think it gives you something to contemplate and to consider and to encourage other people with. So that's mine for today. The Nature of Independence.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I think, mine would be definitely find out more about blindness as a holistic thing. Find out that the different levels of blindness, there's so many different eye conditions. Even if you have the same eye condition, you might see very differently as well. And so I think, like, just understand that it's a big spectrum and research the spectrum of blindness, not kind of the low hanging fruit type of thing with the worst case scenarios. It's important to understand the bigger picture sometimes.
There you go. You heard it here first, folks. That's where you start now.
Thanks very much for listening, watching, and remember to drop a comment, give us a like, and we'll be back for episode 6. Thank you.
See ya.